Hi and welcome to the second example hand. This time I'm going to take a hand that I played in a live MTT and run through the full thought process for each decision, including most of the questions. The villain in this hand is slightly loose and known to bluff frequently. What kind of tournament is this? It's a £100 MTT with 45 runners and no rebuys. What stage of the tournament is it? We're still in the early stages with 39 remaining. I'll normally play fairly tight during the early phases and look to get value from my big hands. What's the payout structure? It's top heavy with just 5 places paid. If there were more places paid, I'd be more cautious during the early stages. But here I'm more focused on finishing first and will take whatever opportunities come my way. Are there ICM implications? Not really, for the reasons already stated. We're a long way from the money. There's no real pressure yet. How many players are at the table? 7, and with antes in, there's a need to stay busy. What do I know about my opponents? I don't have any statistical data, but I know that there are some playing too many hands pre-flop, calling too much and splashing around a bit post-flop. What are their levels of thinking? Well, there's a mixture of levels 1 to 2, mostly level 2. The villain on the button in this hand is a level 2 thinker, not too concerned with his own image, but thinking hard about what his opponents are holding. The under the gun villain is a loose, passive player doing some level 2 thinking. What's my position? I'm second to act, and my opening range would be a standard early mid position opening range with quite a few suited aces thrown into the mix. Because there's a few calling stations at the table, I might tighten to a value heavy range and a large opening bet size. What are the positions of each opponent? I've noted the under the gun player and the small blind are the 2 players who have knocked out an opponent. What is my stack size? I have 80 big blinds, so a normal raise size will create an SPR of around 10 when I get 1 caller. If I choose a larger sizing, I can get that down to 4 or 5, which might be good with some of my premium hands. What are the stack sizes of my opponents? We're all deep, so it's not the most important consideration here, but I'm aware of the under the gun player and the small blind as they have very deep stacks already. The other table, they look similar as we're only 25 minutes into the tournament. What are the blinds and antes? It's level 1, and I'm going to keep the stacks displayed in big blinds, so there's no need to convert to chip values. The antes are 15%. The blinds will be going up in 5 minutes. What's the action in front of me? Well, if we play it through, there's a limp from under the gun, and I'm next to act. What are my pot odds? There's 3.55 big blinds in the middle, and it's 1 big blind to call, so 22%. I know that because 3 to 1 is 25% and 4 to 1 is 20%, so it's between the two. I don't even need an exact number. If I raise, I want to present less attractive pot odds to my opponents as they have been calling a bit too much. If I went to 6 big blinds, the players not in the blinds would need 39% pot odds to call. What should the under the gun villain's limping range look like here? In truth, he shouldn't really have one, but a sensible limping range would consist of some pocket pairs, some suited connectors, and a few strong hands in there for balance. The hands in the limping range would also have to be in the raising range, so you'd sometimes limp and sometimes raise. And what about my ranges? My range for raising after the limper changes quite a bit. If I go with a huge 6 times sizing, which I would quite like to do on this type of table, my GTO raising range narrows to just 5%. I'll be limping with another 15%. So although I wouldn't normally have a limping strategy, behind another limper, it does start to become more attractive to just limp in and try and see a flop. The GTO 5% raising range contains a lot of mixed strategy. I'll sometimes raise with ace-8 suited and better, sometimes with king-9 suited and better, sometimes with ace-10 off and better, king-queen, king-jack, pocket eights and better. It's a lot of hands at low frequencies, so most of these hands I'll be limping with at a high frequency and then sometimes choosing to raise. Interestingly, the two hands that the GTO range wants me to raise with almost a 100% frequency are ace-jack suited and ace-queen suited. Even ace-ace should be limped in with sometimes here for balancing purposes. My 15% limping range contains all the weak pocket pairs, all the weak suited aces, the suited broadways, 8-9 suited and better, plus the usual off-suited hands from ace-8 off and better. You might not like the large limping range, but it's a symptom of when I choose a large raise size, I can't raise as frequently to that sizing. So, if I'm only giving the option of limping or going to a 6x raise, then you're just going to have to accept that there's a lot in the limping range. You could change that around and choose a more normal raise sizing and have many more hands in it. Whenever someone limps in, it does give a bit more of a reason to limp in with them because the pot odds are so good. Now, what about the under the gun villain's actual limping range? I think this will differ quite a bit from what's GTO. He doesn't do much raising, so limps with most of his playable hands. I think he's choosing most broadways, plus pocket pairs, a few suited connected hands, raising only with his premiums. So how can I exploit this villain in the table conditions? And what effect will this have on my ranges and sizings? I want to take advantage of the fact that they're playing weak ranges and calling too much. The main adjustment I would make here is to increase my raise sizing. My normal raise size would be 3 times the big blind, plus 1 for the limper, so 4x. But here, I'd adjust to 6x. I'm looking to get extra value from my value hands and exploit the calling stations. I'd also simplify my own range so there are fewer bluffing hands. I don't need to be deceptive if opponents are calling too much with weak ranges. There's no real need for all the GTO balancing, though a little bit is still a reasonable idea. I might choose to play a few more hands for value, but I would tend not to make this adjustment when sat in early mid position. The earlier your position, the more static your ranges need to be. You can't adjust so much for the table conditions. When you're sat in later position, you can make quite large adjustments. So if our GTO range was to raise with 5% of our hands, I'd be looking to stick to our best 5%. So 9-9 and better, ace-jack suited, ace-queen off, something like that. I would also try and learn from the GTO solution that, occasionally limping with some of the stronger hands there it is a good enough idea, and perhaps occasionally raising with a slightly weaker hand is okay too. And this is just incorporating a small amount of the GTO balancing into the range building, just applying a small amount of it. And this is an adjustment that's good for playing against this type of loose passive table. So what are my hole cards? Well, they're king. This hand will nearly always belong in my raising range, and it's right at the top. If I get 3-bet, I can sometimes call and sometimes 4-bet. Not always 4-bet, because when we start out with a raising range as narrow as 5%, it's important to understand that 3-bet ranges are super tight, and 4-bet ranges are getting really, really narrow to the point where, even king's not an automatic 4-bet. After our raise, the other players fold to the button calls, and then the rest of them fold, and that means we can begin the to spar BAP God H post-flop process. I start by reminding myself of the tournament situation. I'm not repeating all the individual questions, but I might pick out a specific question and answer that is relevant to the situation. So here I might say to myself, look, it's level 1, but the ICM implications are not big. So if you need to play for stacks here, it's probably worthwhile. How many players are in the hand? We're now heads up, just me and the button involved. Is this player passive or aggressive? So although the table's passive, this particular opponent is loose, but not exactly passive. We've seen him bluffing before, and he's not afraid to throw around chips. I'm honing my thoughts onto this particular villain and his general playing style. What else do I know about him? I think he bluffs too much. That opens the door for sometimes slow playing hands. What's his level of thinking? He's on level 2. He's thinking about what we hold, but I don't think he's concerned about how we perceive him. That means we don't have to get too elaborate with our play. What's the SPR? It's about 4.5. He's the effective stack with just less than 66 bigs, with 15.5 in the middle, so 4.5. Sometimes small enough to commit everything with just one overpair. So whilst I'm not looking to go crazy with a one pair hand, I'm aware of the possibility of playing for stacks. What about position? We're out of position for the post-flop action. What was the previous action? The button called the 6x raise, so we ought to put him on a range before the post-flop action if we have time. A GTO range would be 5.3%, consisting of pocket 4s to pocket 10s, ace-9 suited to ace-queen suited, king-queen suited, ace-jack off, and ace-queen off. Not many hands. He's probably calling with quite a few more though, maybe 13%. I'm going to assume the wider range. Who was the aggressor? I'm going into the post-flop action as the raiser out of position, which is post-flop scenario 3 from my post-flop scenarios. I usually c-bet a high percentage if I 3-bet pre-flop. What's the board texture? The flop is 10 of clubs, 6 of clubs, jack of diamonds, which is quite wet. It also hits our opponent's range slightly better than ours. I'm carrying through our 5% range and our opponent's 13% range. So we clearly have an equity advantage. On a wet board like this, I'd traditionally choose a 50 to 75% sizing, but the SPR is also a factor here when choosing bet size. There's no post-flop action to recap, so we can skip that entirely. What pot odds would be presented if we laid a c-bet of half the pot? The answer, of course, is 25%. There's certainly a case for a larger bet size. If we stick with this half pot size bet, what's a good GTO c-bet frequency here? Pretty close to 100%. We could check sometimes with weak pairs or middle pair, but if you c-bet here 100% of the time, that's close to optimal. No check raise range is necessary. What about his GTO response? He's going to be able to call along in position with most of his hands and fold out his weakest hands. He should not really have a raising range, but he can call with all his draws. This is typical when facing a strong raiser. What do I actually think my opponent's calling range will be? He can probably play quite close to perfectly here, though he may call along with some trash too much or even start raising with some hands, which would be a mistake. I'll think I'll keep his range close to the GTO range here, as it's tough to predict what he would actually be doing. What adjustments should I make? If I can't predict what mistakes he's going to make, nothing. If he calls too much, I would take out a few of my weaker hands from my c-bet range. That's the only adjustment I would possibly think about making here. What hand do I have? I've got an overpair, which I should be c-betting with. It's quite a strong hand within my range, but it's no longer at the top of my range. I do go ahead and make that bet, and just slightly less than half the pot. And my opponent calls. Again, I consider the tournament situation briefly before honing in on my opponent. What's he going to do too much of on the turn? Possibly he'll overcall. I should still be focusing on value here. What's the SPR? Now is down to just 2, and we can still play for stacks if we wish. Being aware of the pot geometry is important here. What about position? 2 more streets out of position. And finally, what's the action? Let's update his range because he's just called this flop c-bet. I already predicted this range, so there's not much to do. He still has a wider range than us, but he's down to around 120 combos. It's the same range as on the flop minus his worst 25%. The turn card is the 4 of diamonds, which brings about a second flush draw and misses our ranges. There's not much difference now in equity between the 2 ranges. We don't need to recap any action when we're first to act, but if we were too slow in recapping the previous action, we can take this opportunity to consider the flop action. What about pot odds? I'll always try and bet more than half the pot when I think there's a strong likelihood of my opponent drawing. There are several different drawing hands possible here. If I bet more than half the pot, his odds will be more than 25%. My GTO turn c-bet range is down to 57%. That's because there is now very little difference in equity between our ranges and we're still out of position. I should c-bet my strongest holdings and check my weaker holdings, but ensure there's some mixing. Often the GTO mix involves checking one of the combinations of your sets and betting the other 2. That's just one pattern that I've noticed. Once again, if I c-bet the turn, the villain will likely call 75% and fold 25% with no real raising hands. These are the right frequencies. If I check, he should bet around 50% of the time with a mixed strategy. But what do I actually think he will call with if I bet the turn? Probably most of his hands. I think he's likely to overcall here, and he may also overplay some draws or strong hands and start raising. If he overcalls, how should I adjust my range for c-betting? I should, of course, keep it value orientated and ensure the sizing is good. When I assess the range, it looks value focused already, so I don't need to deviate much from the GTO suggestion. I'll just do what it says, but with much less mixing. So I'll check close to 100% when I'm weak and bet close to 100% when I'm strong. Finally, our hand is still an overpair. We do have the king of clubs, which blocks some flush draws. We have 76% equity against his range, which is still towards the top part of our range. The GTO play here is a mixture of c-bets and checks. I would definitely bet again, as we are staying value orientated. I go ahead and bet 55% of the pot. The villain calls again. My tournament life is now in the balance with just a single bet left. I remind myself of the lack of ICM factor and think about my opponent's behavior. What will he do if I check? What will he do if I shove? I don't have the answers, but I'm thinking ahead to this river card. What's the SPR? We should know what's in the middle and what's left. There's 63 big blinds in the middle with a normal bet size remaining 42 big blinds. I'm out of position for this river. What about the previous action? How does his call on the turn narrow his range? Well, it made him fold some pocket pairs, I think, but I think he's going to call along with most of his hands, and he gets here with too many draws and not enough strong hands. So we progress to the river. The river card is the 8 of clubs, completing a possible flush and a few unlikely straights. So how does the final board texture fit our ranges? It's easy to get really negative when a card like this completes draws on the river. Remember, your opponent will likely be afraid of it too, and that a flush or a straight only make up a small percentage of his hand range. In fact, our opponent will have a straight close to never and a flush less than 10% of the time. This card has not helped him as much as it might first appear. The equity of our range against his has actually increased slightly. Once again, we can skip the post-flop action as we are first to act. You'll get used to this pattern when you're out of position post-flop. Over time, you can also skip the pot odds when there are no bets in front of you. But what odds would you give your opponent if you did shove all in here? It's roughly 42 bigs to win 105. That's 28%. I know that because it's 2.5 to 1, 66%. Pot size gives him 2 to 1 or 33%, and half pot gives him 3 to 1 or 25%. When it's in between like this, it's going to be between 25 and 33%. You don't need to know it's precisely 28%, but the more you practice this, the more accurate you will be. It's astonishingly easy once you've done it 1,000 times. I just commit them to memory when I come across them, so 2/3 pot bet's quite common, and I recognize it's always 28%. So it's a good one to remember. Coming back to our questioning drill, let's now ask what our GTO range should look like on the river. We can get value out of a lot of marginal hands here, so betting a good frequency is recommended. For an all-in bet size, the optimal range is around 70%, which consists of all our strong hands plus some bluffing combos with ace-king off and king-queen suited. The 30% checks consist of some missed draws and ace-10 suited, plus occasionally sets. For those of you wondering when to bluff with ace-king off or king-queen suited, you should prioritize the hands when you hold a club, as that acts as a blocker and denies some of his important ace-high or king-high flushes. King, queen of diamonds would be a bad choice to bluff with, as the diamond draws were still a part of his continuance range, so we now want him to have diamonds in his hand, so blocking them becomes a bad thing. There's a lot of detail I could discuss about the precise way these GTO ranges are built, but for now focus on the frequency of around 70% bets. This is very regularly a good betting frequency when ranges are close together. Now, what about his range for calling if I bet? His pot odds would be 28%, so he needs to call with all the hands he thinks he can achieve 28% equity. That's roughly half of his hand range. The borderline hands are all the ones where he has a one pair holding. Normally, you would expect him to call with top pair, yet fold, for example, 8-7 suited. The GTO solution, though, is more complicated and requires an in-depth understanding of blockers, which is not the purpose of this discussion. What about his range if I check? Now he can shove around 50% of his range, including most top pair combos, all his strong hands, plus quite a few bluffs. His best bluffing hands would be some combos of king, queen. Once again, don't worry about the specific hands so much, but try and get a grasp on the frequency. His bluffing ratio should be in sync with the pot odds he presents to us. So in this case, 28% or 2.5 to 1. So after he assesses how many hands he can get value from, for example, 30 combos, he should then aim to add 12 bluffing combos to find the optimal ratio. Moving on now from those two separate strands of GTO thoughts, both for when I bet and when I check, let's now ask what I expect this opponent's ranges to actually look like. I expect if I shove, he will call close to perfectly. He won't get it exactly right, but he'll call with top pair and better, and that's not far off. What about if I check? This time, I think he'll make some mistakes. I think he'll shove all his bluffs, and that's around half his range. I would be able to call quite light. So, what deviations should I make to my shoving range? I could try trapping with a few of my marginal hands. So build quite a large check calling range consisting of middle pairs and top pairs. Finally, what about my hand King-King? The GTO range has it clearly in the value shoving range. When I played the hand, I actually chose to check and trap my opponent because I felt he was going to bluff too often. On closer analysis, I think King-King was just too strong a hand to put in my check call range, and I should have kept it simple and simply shoved. My opponent, though, did shove and shoved correctly with King-Queen off, holding the Queen of Clubs, which was a useful blocker to flushes. In fact, this was one of the best bluffing hands he had. I was able to call and win, but it wasn't necessarily the best play. The deviation I chose from GTO probably deviated too far. The second example hand was more challenging than the first. For the third hand, we'll return to cash, but this time we'll go to the best kind of table, a table full of fish.